Bethany Granger trusted them, Uncle Dwight, Uncle Carl, and Uncle Henry. They were her protectors, her father figures after tragedy struck. But behind their warm smiles and comforting words, a chilling secret festered. For years, the three men who were supposed to keep her safe were slowly stealing pieces of her innocence, until her entire world collapsed under the weight of their lies. When she tried to escape, only one truth remained: the people closest to her were the ones she should have feared the most. Bethany Granger grew up in the kind of town where nothing ever seemed to happen. Tucked deep in rural Tennessee, the community was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and family ties stretched back generations. Bethany's family was one of the most well-known in the area. Her mother, Martha, was a respected figure in the church, and her three brothers, Dwight, Carl, and Henry, were considered hard-working, dependable men. The Grangers were known for their strong family values, and their presence could be felt at every town event, from the local fair to Sunday service. On the surface, they were the epitome of a wholesome Southern family. But as Bethany would later prove, appearances can be tragically deceiving. Bethany's childhood was quiet and uneventful until tragedy struck when she was 14. Her father, Robert Granger, died in a car accident on his way home from work. The loss devastated the family. Martha fell into a deep depression, leaving Bethany emotionally stranded during a time she needed guidance the most. That's when her uncles stepped in. One by one, each of the brothers took a special interest in her well-being. They helped with schoolwork, drove her to appointments, and offered her a place to stay whenever things at home became overwhelming. At first, it seemed like a blessing. Bethany had three protective male figures in her life, all determined to help her through the darkness, but something changed over time. Friends noticed Bethany becoming more withdrawn. She stopped participating in school clubs and began missing classes. Her grades, once among the top in her class, began to slide. Teachers assumed she was still grieving her father. But Bethany never talked about grief. She talked about how safe she felt at Uncle Carl's, how peaceful it was at Dwight's cabin, and how much she enjoyed reading books in Henry's attic. She spent increasing amounts of time at each of their homes, often staying over for days at a time. Her mother didn't ask many questions, grateful someone else was taking care of her daughter during her own emotional fog. The community didn't question the arrangements either. After all, the Grangers were family. Everyone trusted them. Bethany was quiet, polite, and never caused trouble. If she was staying with her uncles, it must have been for a good reason. But under the surface, a complex web of manipulation and control had already taken root. The attention Bethany received from each uncle wasn't just familial, it was possessive, secretive, and slowly crossing boundaries. What began as support became something much darker. Each uncle treated Bethany like she belonged to him, convincing her their bond was special, unique, and not to be shared with anyone else. By the time she turned 18, Bethany was no longer the girl everyone thought they knew. She had grown distant from her peers, dropped out of local college plans, and quit her job at the town library. She lived between the homes of her three uncles, her presence accepted but never questioned. Nobody noticed the warning signs, or maybe they just chose not to see them. Either way, the illusion of a perfect family was about to shatter, and the truth that would come out would shake the entire town to its core. In early January 2019, Bethany Granger vanished. It wasn't sudden in the traditional sense. There was no loud announcement or missing persons alert that immediately captured attention. Instead, it started as a quiet absence. Her co-workers at the local diner noticed she hadn't shown up for her weekend shifts. She wasn't answering texts or returning calls. At first, everyone assumed she had taken a trip or needed a break. But as the days turned into weeks, concern slowly began to spread. Bethany's mother, Martha, offered a simple explanation to anyone who asked. Bethany had moved to Nashville to start fresh. She needed space, she said, a change of scenery, something different after a tough few years. Most people accepted the story without much question. It wasn't unusual for a young woman to want to get out of a small town. Still, for those who had known Bethany more personally, the story didn't quite fit. She had never mentioned plans to move. She had no job waiting for her in the city, no friends there, no relatives to stay with. Even her social media went completely silent after January 4th. That wasn't like her. The first red flag came from her old manager at the diner. Bethany had worked there since she was 16, and while she was quiet, she was never irresponsible. She didn't formally quit or collect her last paycheck. She simply stopped showing up. He filed a report with the local sheriff's office, unsure of what else to do. Meanwhile, one of her old classmates tried reaching out after hearing rumors of her move to Nashville, but her messages were left unread. That's when the unease truly began to grow. Then, an anonymous phone call came into the sheriff's department. The voice on the line didn't give a name and didn't stay on long. The caller said that Bethany wasn't in Nashville and she hadn't moved at all. Instead, she had been spending time with her three uncles, Dwight, Carl, and Henry, and not in the way people might expect. The voice hinted at something deeply disturbing, mentioning relationships and secrets the family would do anything to keep quiet. Before the dispatcher could ask for details, the call ended. At first, law enforcement hesitated. It sounded too far-fetched, like a cruel prank. Still, given the growing concern and the strange circumstances around Bethany's disappearance, they decided to take a closer look. Officers visited Martha's home for a welfare check. She repeated her story. Bethany had packed up and left on her own. She'd spoken to her on the phone a couple of times, but not recently. When asked for proof, text messages, recent call logs, she couldn't provide any. Her responses were vague, and her eyes avoided direct contact. Something was off. Investigators quietly started tracing Bethany's last known movements. They pulled location data from her phone, reviewed camera footage from local gas stations, and interviewed people who had seen her in the weeks before she vanished. Her last known location was nowhere near Nashville. It was in the wooded area near Uncle Dwight's cabin. That single data point shifted the investigation into high gear and sent detectives down a path that would expose secrets no one in town was prepared to hear. Investigators began by focusing on the only lead they had, Bethany's phone records. The data showed her last signal had pinged from a cell tower near Uncle Dwight's isolated cabin, deep in the woods on the edge of town. The location was remote, surrounded by dense trees and dirt roads, far from any public view. Detectives visited Dwight's property under the pretext of asking questions about Bethany's whereabouts. He appeared cooperative but indifferent. He confirmed that Bethany had stayed with him briefly in the fall, claiming she was going through a hard time and needed space. He said she left in November and hadn't returned. He hadn't heard from her since. Despite his calm demeanor, investigators left the property with a sense of unease. Something didn't feel right. Dwight's cabin was rustic but clean, almost too clean. There were no signs anyone had recently been living there. No women's items, no extra belongings, nothing that suggested a second person had been inside. Still, the location data told a different story. Bethany had been there in early January, weeks after Dwight claimed she left. To dig deeper, detectives looked at neighboring properties and questioned locals who might have seen Bethany. One man, a hunter who often used trail cameras to monitor wildlife, mentioned that one of his cameras faced a road leading to Dwight's cabin. With his permission, they reviewed the footage. What they found stunned them. Grainy, low resolution. Clips clearly showed Bethany walking toward Dwight's cabin alone on January 2nd. There was no footage of her leaving. With that discovery, search warrants were obtained for all three uncles' properties. The next stop was Uncle Carl's home. Carl lived in a modest house with an attached workshop and a large storage shed behind the property. Unlike Dwight, Carl seemed anxious when questioned. He said Bethany had stopped by a few times but hadn't stayed long. But inside the shed, investigators found evidence that contradicted his story. Behind a stack of old furniture, they discovered a mattress. On the floor, several articles of women's clothing, a half-empty bottle of perfume, and a notebook. Inside the notebook were pages of Bethany's handwriting, personal entries describing confusion, emotional dependence, and conflicted feelings about her uncles. One entry read, "They say they love me in different ways, but it all feels the same now, trapped." The third property, belonging to Uncle Henry, offered more disturbing insight. In the attic above his garage, investigators found a box filled with letters, dozens of them. All were written by Bethany and addressed to Henry. The letters ranged in tone from romantic to desperate, speaking of secret meetings and promises of starting over. Some of the letters were stained, aged, and creased from being read repeatedly. In a small locked drawer beside the box, detectives found photographs, some clearly taken without Bethany's knowledge. It was clear Henry had been obsessed with her. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. Bethany hadn't simply run away. She had been groomed, manipulated, and passed between the three men who were supposed to protect her. The evidence painted a disturbing picture of long-term psychological and sexual exploitation. But the question remained, where was Bethany now? The answer would come just days later, and it would be more horrifying than anyone expected. With mounting evidence and an urgent sense of dread, investigators returned to Uncle Carl's property for a full forensic search. The shed had already revealed signs of Bethany's presence, but now their attention turned to a large, rusted freezer sitting at the back of the barn. At first glance, it looked ordinary, stacked with bags of frozen meat, sealed containers, and ice-covered trays. But as officers began removing the top layers, a foul, unnatural odor began to rise. Underneath the frozen food, wrapped tightly in black plastic and layers of duct tape, they found the body of Bethany Granger. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigative team and the entire community. Bethany had been missing for nearly a month, and now the worst fears had been confirmed. Her body was frozen solid, concealed beneath a decoy of everyday items, hidden in plain sight. Forensic pathologists later determined she had died from blunt force trauma to the head. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. It suggested she had either been caught off guard or had trusted her killer completely in her final moments. Uncle Carl was immediately taken into custody. His demeanor shifted from nervous to defeated. He admitted to hiding Bethany's body but insisted that her death had been accidental. According to his statement, they had argued one night when she told him she was going to leave and report everything to the police. Carl claimed he panicked during the argument, pushed her, and she hit her head on a piece of furniture. When he realized she wasn't moving, he didn't call for help. Instead, he dragged her body to the barn and concealed it in the freezer. His confession, though shocking, only scratched the surface of a much deeper web of abuse and deception. The investigation didn't stop with Carl's arrest. Evidence from Dwight's and Henry's properties painted a picture of a young woman emotionally entangled with all three men. Each uncle had developed an unhealthy attachment to Bethany, manipulating her with affection, attention, and emotional dependency. Her journal entries, letters, and private writings revealed years of grooming, beginning when she was just a teenager. She had been isolated, made to believe their actions were signs of love, not exploitation. Public reaction was swift and severe. The town that once viewed the Grangers as a model family now saw them as monsters. People questioned how this had gone unnoticed for so long. How had no one seen the signs? The local media erupted with coverage, and soon national outlets picked up the story. Bethany's face appeared on every screen, accompanied by words like betrayal, abuse, and murder. As the case built toward trial, prosecutors prepared to charge Dwight and Henry with multiple counts of sexual abuse, exploitation, and conspiracy. Carl faced the most serious charge, second-degree murder. What began as a missing persons case had evolved into one of the most disturbing examples of familial abuse the region had ever seen. The truth about what happened to Bethany Granger was no longer a mystery, but the scars it left on everyone who knew her were only beginning to show. The trial of Carl Granger began in early 2020, drawing national media attention and filling the small courthouse with reporters, locals, and stunned onlookers. The once respected family name had become synonymous with betrayal and hidden abuse. Prosecutors presented their case with methodical precision, outlining the disturbing timeline of Bethany's final years. They painted a picture of a young woman systematically groomed, emotionally manipulated, and ultimately silenced when she threatened to break free. Carl's defense team stuck to his initial claim that Bethany's death had been accidental, the result of a heated argument gone wrong. They described him as a man overwhelmed by guilt, someone who made a horrible mistake but never intended to kill her. But the prosecution countered with the evidence: the carefully wrapped body, the effort to conceal it, and the lack of any attempt to seek medical help or report the death. They emphasized how Carl continued to live a normal life in the weeks that followed, even attending church and family dinners while Bethany's body remained hidden in his freezer. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as forensic experts shared their findings. The blow to Bethany's head had been forceful and deliberate. The autopsy revealed signs of prior physical contact and psychological trauma. Her journal, introduced into evidence, revealed a heartbreaking progression of fear, confusion, and entrapment. In one entry, written weeks before her death, she described feeling like a ghost in 3 houses, unsure of who she was anymore or what love was supposed to feel like. Dwight and Henry were also put on trial, though their charges were separate and centered on sexual abuse, coercion, and conspiracy. Both men denied the accusations, but the letters, photos, and testimony from forensic psychologists made their defenses weak. One psychologist explained how Bethany had likely developed trauma bonding with her uncles, a survival mechanism where victims form emotional connections to their abusers. She was not simply manipulated, she was mentally imprisoned. The verdicts came after weeks of emotional testimony and damning evidence. Carl Granger was found guilty of second-degree murder and unlawful concealment of a body. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Dwight and Henry were both convicted on multiple counts of sexual misconduct and received lengthy prison terms. The courtroom offered no applause, no sense of victory, just the heavy silence of a town forced to confront the rot that had been growing within one of its most trusted families. Bethany's story became a symbol of how abuse can hide in plain sight. Her case was studied by law enforcement, used in training programs for identifying grooming behaviors and familial exploitation. Advocacy groups spoke her name in workshops and lectures, vowing to shine a light where others failed to look. A memorial garden was built outside the town library where she once worked, simple, quiet, and surrounded by flowers she used to love. The tragedy of Bethany Granger lives on as a painful reminder that love can be twisted into a weapon, and sometimes the people who say they are protecting you are the ones you need protection from most.